Last time I poked around a little bit, talking about a woman's situation in the first century in the Greco-Roman world, the folks that Paul would have been thinking of and essentially speaking to as he wrote Timothy. We're in First Timothy chapter 3, and in verse 11, he writes, "In the same way, the women are to be worthy of respect, not malicious talkers, but temperate and trustworthy in everything." In that culture, I mentioned to you that there were several very basic kinds of things that set the role and work of women in that culture. Like, for instance, I mentioned how the hours of operation kind of thing. Really, it was just daylight. Yeah, there were lamps, and there were certain things that could be done by firelight, by lamplight, but uh, you have you ever tried to do anything that's very meticulous by lamplight? And oh, by the way, the kinds of lamps that they had, we're not talking about Coleman kerosene lamps that shed a pretty strong, bright light pattern. We're talking about smaller lamps. And even if you had lots of those lamps around, a couple of quick things. Number one, that's a pretty high level accident waiting for happen. I mean, you're talking about a fire hazard there. Well, the second thing, and this is really more important in that culture, is oil was an expense. I mean, generally people didn't have their olive trees in their backyard that they would harvest olives off of and press out for oil. You had to go purchase oil. It was an expense, and it wasn't abusively expensive, but it was an expense. Okay, so daylight provided their, I mean, that put the bookends on the day, sun up, sun down. Second thing, and I mentioned this, was that no refrigeration, which meant you bought today what you would need today. You didn't even buy yesterday what you would need today in most cases, because there were no preservatives and there was no way to refrigerate and store things. So now put all that together and think about, okay, what for women in that culture, unlike our culture in lots of ways, a woman was expected, maybe demanded, to stay at home and take care of the home and family. Oh, by the way, one of the highest expectations is that a woman would marry. And then connected to that was that she would bear children. Our culture is not at all that way. Marry if you want to. It's no big deal if you don't. And I'm not against that. Have kids if you want to. Don't if you don't. I'm not necessarily against that either. But that's not the way the world worked in Century 1 for women. But an unmarried woman, and oh, by the way, there's so many ways the world is different. And one of the ways was by about age 14, most girls were either promised to be married or were already married. So if a woman was unmarried, then there had to be some extenuating circumstance. She would probably not be living on her own. She would have been living with her family, the family of origin. So Okay. Since a woman's primary context was the home, and since doing the things, if you think about cooking, I'm just thinking about uh, 50 years ago when I was a little kid. Actually, I wasn't even a little kid 50 years ago. I was like a senior in high school. Ooh, that's ugly. Anyway, look back in history and realize it took longer for meal preparation and cleaning up and laundry. It was not easy. There were some historians describe the culture in a way that women just didn't appear outside the home. And a lot of homes had courtyards, not just the building of the house, but they didn't go out. And if they went out, they were accompanied. They rarely went on their own. This is really hard for us to imagine. Okay, the world for women in century one was it's so limited compared to the world for women today. Now I know there are contexts, places where women are not treated with full dignity. I know that. And it probably would never have been that big a deal to me, except I have 3 daughters and a wife. All 4 of them are probably smarter than me, and they're so capable, but there are times when it has hurt my heart to realize that they're going to be pushing upstream to be able to engage their gifts and their abilities to the fullest. Even at that, compared to what it would have been in century one, it's daylight and dark. Is there a glass ceiling? Well, yeah. However, in the last 15 or 20 years, that ceiling has been moving up and up. And there's not a time for me to get into the whole women's rights and what's right and wrong and should and shouldn't be in our culture. But in century one, if you would take a century 21 woman and put her back in century one, she would feel fairly imprisoned, I'm pretty sure. And so Paul speaks into that. And let's just get back to the text now. The women are to be worthy of respect. We talked about what worthy of respect requires. It requires respectability. And I think one of the big things is consistency. It has to do with showing up. Your word is your bond. I know that's the man phrase, but honestly, you do what you say you will do. Not malicious talkers. Now, I don't want to make this into a caricature, but consider women in century one lived in a very segregated world, not racially, although there was that, but gender separation, right? At the synagogue, women didn't sit with their husbands. There was a woman's section, and it wasn't the best seats in the house. A man would rarely show up at the well, the community well. That was the women gathered there. A man would rarely show up at the riverside where women did their laundry. That was where women went. And so there was this community within a community, a subculture of sorts of women. And men are this way too. when you put a bunch of men together, they're eventually, once they run out of sports talk and finish pounding their chest for how good they are at their career, then they're going to talk about people. And what Paul is saying is the temptation to be a malicious talker. What's that got to do with? I think it has mainly to do with gossip. I don't know that, the settings changed, but the damage that malicious gossip does has not changed over time. Malicious gossips, malicious talk. Paul says the women are not malicious talkers. I'm now. This is the no-duh section of my talk. Christian women are to be marked by the fact that they just don't do that. It's almost as if, don't bother trying to spread gossip to a godly woman because she's not in. She just won't, and she won't participate. Okay, I think that's pretty cool. And then he goes on to say, and temperate. Evidently, historians confirm that sometimes women would pass the jug around and, they would overdrink. It's not just a man's issue, but Paul says they are temperate. This generally has to do with, it involves alcoholic drink. It also, though, has to do with the moderation of the spectrum of your life. That you don't live in the extremes, too much or too little. You live in the balance of what I would call the middle. And trustworthy in everything. Well, what Christian wouldn't want to or shouldn't be trustworthy in everything? So, in some regards, what Paul has to say of women is really no different than what he's been saying about men. It is a much shorter passage of, just in terms of the volume of words, there's less words there about how women are to be and how they're to conduct their lives. But the broad strokes are really the same. In some ways, I think he could have written, and women, in terms of your character, this is how you should be as well. And really, when he said in the same way at the beginning of verse 11, I think that's kind of what he was saying. So what's this got to do with women today? And oh, by the way, you'd be right if you were saying, well, you got nothing to lose in this. You got no dog in the fight. You're not a woman. You're right. I do have this. I am committed to treating women as Christ treated them, with respect and dignity. Peter writes that we're to treat them thoughtfully, in a considerate way, in terms of men toward women, and understand that they are the weaker partner. I don't, because I've got a partner who is, although physically she's not as strong as I am, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, she's way, way down the road better than me. I want to treat her with care not because she's fragile, but because she's precious. Now, God's design for women is that they would live a life of deep character. Well, there's no reason for me to keep going and going. I mean, that does it really pretty much from my perspective. So next time we'll pick it up at verse 12 on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.